I'm extremely pleased to introduce a session with Casey Newton, who has long been one of the foremost journalists with a newsletter that has become a must read for those of us in the industry and working with the industry or working adjacent to the industry, as well as Sheera Frenkel of the New York Times, who has long been one of the leading experts and journalists at the New York Times. With that, I would also encourage you to ask questions via the SEO app for both of these extremely wonderful journalists. And with that, I turn over to Sheera for the first question.
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm doing so well, Sharon. It's so nice to talk to you.
You too. This is the closest we're come to in person in a long time, Casey.
It is. I know it's been far too long, but I am optimistic, I guess, that I'll get to see you in real life sometime soon.
Yes. So I thought we would maybe open up the conversation on how different the pacing of news feels right now on disinformation and social media. And if we flash back to a year ago and where we were heading into the elections with the daily stories of false news that was spreading, misinformation, disinformation, what do you think's changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the United States, a lot of the reporting around disinformation, misinformation was driven by concerns around the election, right? What kinds of misinformation could potentially swing the outcome, right? Like I think about the Hunter Biden laptop and the sort of furor over, to what extent should social platforms allow that on the platform? But then we had an election and Trump was dislodged from office, and we have a government that promotes disinformation way less aggressively. And so I think the pace has really slowed. At the same time, I think if you look internationally, you're seeing more and more governments still using these same platforms to still advance their influence operations. And so the threat is very much with us. I just think in the United States, fortunately, at least for the time being, it's receded a little bit into the background.
For sure. It felt like the appetite for stories about disinformation was almost insatiable, both from editors and from readers. Yeah. And it was this critical time of elections and everything going on. And almost every day we were publishing stories about either trying to provide facts to people or to just point out trends in it. I don't know, from my end, it feels like the bar is also much higher because at this point, Americans know the word disinformation, and it's looking for it, being aware from it. It feels like we've achieved a certain level of knowledge or expertise there. And now it's about a more sophisticated story, whether it's what's happening internationally or trends in disinformation or new ways in which disinformation is being spread. At least for me as a reporter, it feels like we've been able to get more sophisticated and nuanced about how we cover it.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm curious, though, like how you think about the one giant piece of disinformation that is still very much with us in this country, which is this false idea that the election was stolen. This seems like a real challenge for newsrooms because on one hand, there's not some big new breaking development in that every day. But on the other hand, like I saw some research today that suggests that narrative is, hardening in some conservative and extremist communities. So I'm curious how you think about covering that. Like, is that something that you feel like journalists kind of need to return to periodically, or is there a case to maybe give it less attention and deprive it of oxygen?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, you have to be thoughtful about it because you don't want to cover it daily the way we did leading up to November and in the immediate sort of aftermath of November, where it was critical to very quickly factually point out the errors in information being spread. No, dead people are not voting. No, election machines were not rigged in XX county. We had to really quickly do those stories. And I do think they succeeded in persuading a certain percentage of the population that wanted the facts behind what was happening. Right. And I think we now see the limits of that, right? Because there is a certain part of the population that no matter how many expert testimony, they heard, or how many videos they could see of ballots being counted accurately and fairly, they were still going to believe the election was stolen. And at this point, anytime we write about it, it almost feels like we are giving oxygen to the argument even existing. I think, I think my colleague Davy Alba did a really great job with that story of the vacuum in social media that Trump left when he was booted off of Twitter and Facebook, because it touched on election fraud, right? It said, like, since he's been booted off of Twitter and Facebook, we've seen a drop in the hashtags and in general in the narratives that the election was stolen. So it showed the platforms how effective they could be in deplatforming somebody. And those kinds of stories I think are really illuminating and important, but we have to pick and choose, right? How we write them and when we write them.
Yeah. That seems like the right approach. And that was a great story by Davey.
For me, like the big lie, the election fraud stuff, and all the misinformation that existed around COVID and vaccines, they kind of fall into two very similar buckets of people that don't want necessarily to read the facts. They're holding a certain position on something. And yeah, it's like a brave new world for us as journalists about how we work in that information landscape of people who don't actually want the facts on whether vaccines are effective, on whether or not the vote was accurate and fair. And do we as journalists just say, well, we can't reach you, you don't want what we have to give? Or do we find a new way forward?
Right. Yeah, I mean that, and I feel like that question of, do you even want the facts, is a question that spans both journalism and platforms, right? As journalists, we're able to apply really high editorial standards to what we write. We fact check things. We can take our time with things. On social platforms, things fly fast and furious. But often, I feel like we wind up running into the same problem, which is that even if you are a platform and you put up a knowledge panel that says, vaccines are good for you, ultimately, some significant percentage of people just are not going to want to hear it, or are even going to take that panel as a sign that you've been right all along, right? And that,
Totally.
Big platform really is out to get you. So,
yeah, I think as well, like I sometimes wonder if some of the fault isn't on us about not educating the public a little bit more about what our jobs entail. Like I wish people knew what kind of fact-checking standards we apply to stories, and I don't think many people know that as journalists, we do something called a no surprises process. When we're reporting on a company or a person that's hostile, that hasn't worked with us, we call that company or that person, whether that's Facebook or Twitter, and say, here's everything that's going to be in the story, and you have 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever we give them to respond. And so when the story comes out and the company issues the statement of like, we had no idea, and you're sitting there as a journalist like, yeah, you did. I told you 48 hours ago, this wasn't smart. I wish the public knew and could kind of call that, sorry, bullshit out for what it was. And I think it would put more faith in journalists. It's like, we actually do have good processes in place to make sure we're giving you accurate information.
The press critic, Jay Rosen, has this awesome idea that journalists should essentially like put up a page that walks through their reporting process. So I took that idea from him, both when I started my first newsletter and then when I moved to Platformer. And so when you sign up for Platformer, there's a guide to Platformer. And if you click it, it will say like, here's how I gather information. Here are my sources of information. And I talk about, it's like, I get this information on the record, but, sometimes I let people talk to me and I don't use their names, and here's why. It's not a perfect document. It could stand to be improved, but it honestly just feels so good to have published it because, from time to time when I get questions about it, I can just send people that link and say like, this is how I do what I do. So, one of my favorite sites owned by the New York Times, the Wirecutter, was sort of designed to help you pick the gadgets to buy. And the way they do that is by, writing 46,000 words about, how many vacuums they tested. And at some point I realized that like most people weren't reading the 46,000 words, but the existence of the 46,000 words let people know how seriously the Wirecutter was taking its job. And I sort of feel the same way about writing that kind of document for me, right? It's like, if you see this, that I'm not just, writing a hot take clickbait type stuff.
Yeah, you cannot see this right now because my background is blurred, but I have a vacuum cleaner behind me right now that I bought based on I don't buy anything without checking. But it's exactly like you said. It's because I know that their process is good. I know that they're being fair. I know that they're not getting paid for their reviews. I know they're testing them for a year or a month or whatever is needed. And I agree. I think journalists should be doing more of that. I actually love that page that you have. I think it's so smart. And, we have a book coming out about Facebook, and we decided to open the book with an author's note, which explains our process, and it explains what we did. And it opens with, we interviewed, this many people for thousands of hours. And, normally you put that at the end of a book, and we made a really conscious decision to put it at the beginning, because we knew that one of the things people would say was like, well, how did you do this book? Like, why should we trust what you have to say about Facebook? So we wanted to say at the outset, like, we interviewed more than 400 people. That's what we're basing this book on.
Right.
And this was our process, and this is why we did it. So yeah, I think that's incredibly important in building trust with readers.
Yeah. By the way, I am checking my mailbox every day for the galleys of your book, so you can just feel free to send that to me anytime. But I love the idea with the opening up, right? Like in a way, it's like strange that you would read a 500-page book and then the person would be like, okay, well, here's how we did it, right? Particularly for things where you are going to be, relying on confidential sources or like background information. I do think it's important to set that kind of context up front, particularly a story that is really about information, right? And communication, and how are things shared and known and spread, right? I think like there may be an even higher bar for those of us writing about these platforms to clear in that respect.
Yeah, and it's how the world has changed, right? Like one of the first questions we get now as journalists is, how do you know that? Why should I trust you? I found this blog on the internet that's really sexy and has conspiracy theories, and those were really fun, and I'd rather read that than read your boring, middle of the road take. And you're like, well, my boring middle of the road take is based on, and then you give it, right, the spiel. And yeah, I just think that people are really savvy, and that's great. But I almost feel like we as journalists haven't caught up with that savviness to kind of say to them, here's why you should trust us. We want you to know what our process is so that you can have faith in it. And I think about disinformation researchers, of whom hopefully there are quite a few listening. And I think what's been so amazing about that field is that they put their process up front.
Yeah.
And as reporters, that's like it's like a balm. It's like a soothing balm. Like, here's my process. Here's how I came to this conclusion. And that's just, I wish more researchers, more fields of research opened with that and did it in a really colloquial way, which is something else I think disinformation researchers often do well, which is they explain in very simple terms how they came to the conclusions that they came to.
I agree. I mean, I think that there's a lot that we can take from this kind of scientific approach. I think that sometimes our editors find that it reads as wonky, right? And they're like urging us to make it more accessible, and, the lead needs to sing a little bit more. But I think there is a lot of wisdom in showing your work that way. Just to like introduce a sad note into the conversation, I think one reason why people used to trust journalists more is they just knew more of them, because they would meet journalists in their community. You'd meet a journalist when like you won your basketball or baseball game in high school, or like, maybe you gave a big speech somewhere like when you were, a kid. And people are just meeting those journalists less and less. And so now that we've just all become like snarky abstractions on Twitter, like, of course, people are going to distrust us. And so I think that is like kind of a structural problem that we're working against. And so like now actually is the time for us to think more about how do we introduce ourselves to people and explain what and how we do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I struggle with that because I work for the Times, and there's always going to be attacks on Times journalists, and this idea that we are this like very specific East Coast model of usually like old white dude. And I've met people, and when I've told them I work for the Times, they've asked me if I'm an intern. I mean, I'm almost 40, like I'm not an intern. But it's hard though, because at the same time, like the New York Times has constrictions on what we're allowed to say on social media and how much of myself I can put out there and how much of a personality I can have online. And yeah, I wonder if some of that isn't a very old school approach. Like, did people trust Dan Rather because they felt they knew him? Did they trust, did they trust their local columnists and their local reporters because they felt like, oh, well, I know, Sam, he loves baseball and his team is insert baseball team. I know nothing about baseball. Yeah. That getting to know people made them human, and then you trusted them more.
Totally. And I mean, like, this is a big like way that I think about my reporting process. I've been writing about tech since 2010. And, a lot of it has been very like run of the mill, access driven, Twitter released a new feature kind of reporting. It's the kind of reporting that often gets, criticized and dismissed, often for very fair reasons. But to me, a value of doing that is that I have just met hundreds of product managers and policy people and comms people over a decade. And it's just given me a context that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And so like, that's sort of my equivalent of like showing up at the like high school baseball and basketball game is like, I show up at the product briefing and I just got to know you a little bit as a human being. And then maybe down the road, 3 companies from now, you're going to be able to tell me something that's really interesting, but you trust me because you know me. And that's like, that is just frankly the benefit of like picking a lane and staying in it. And unfortunately, because the journalism industry is just in such perpetual chaos, it just gets rarer and rarer to find like a beat reporter who will stick around for a decade.
Totally. I mean, as you know, I'm not like, I jumped around a bunch in my career. I went, I was a foreign correspondent, and then I came to tech journalism relatively late, I guess, in 2016. And I think I've told you this story before, Casey, but when I joined the New York Times, I was 8 months pregnant. And right. Then I had my baby, I went on maternity leave, and I came back and they told me that I was going to be covering Facebook because our Facebook reporter, Mike Isaac, was on book leave writing a book about Uber. Thus is the world of journalism. And I didn't know anybody. Like I had one source at Facebook, maybe. And so I strapped my then, 4-month-old daughter to a baby carrier, and I hung out at that Starbucks around the corner from Facebook. And I just walked up to people and I was like, "Do you work at Facebook?" "Hi, I'm sure." It was like very old school. "Here's my card. I'm writing about Facebook. I don't know anybody that works at Facebook. Want to talk to me?" And I'd say it worked like one time out of 30 or 40. I think having a cute baby strapped to my chest worked a bit better. They were like, "Who's this crazy lady with a baby?" But it was
it's genius. I've told that story many times. Like when people ask me what I'm bad at about journalism, I'll be like, "Do you know how Sheera Frenkel broke into the beat? Because I would never do that in 100 years." And I have told that story at least 10 times. But it's fantastic.
It's crazy. I mean, honestly, weeks of doing it, and I had a handful of sources, but you know what? A handful of sources are better than 0 sources. And you have to get to know people. They have to know you're real. They have to know you're not just some email address or LinkedIn message. And then they introduce you to other sources, and it builds over time. But I think, as you know, I had a mentor early on in my career that he used crasser language that I'm going to use right now, but he was like, journalists either date to date, and you can imagine what that word was, or they date to marry. And he was like, you always want to be the journalist that dates to marry, because you want a source that's going to be with you for life. You want them to trust you. You don't want to burn them on one story or one scoop. You want them to come back to you every company they go to and every new job they have. You want to be the person that they call up when they see something that upsets them or something that they think is important or newsworthy.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, I mean, I wish that was like a lesson that got learned by more journalists, because I worry that journalists don't always really follow that approach. But yeah, it's a hard industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a hard industry. And I think that, as well, as you said before, when journalists are jumping from beat to beat, there's a sense that you can burn sources at one company because you might just go cover another company in a year or two. And then you've unfortunately sent a bad message to that person. That person might never want to speak to a journalist again.
Right.
Casey, to jump topics a little bit, I'm sort of curious, like, has there been any stories or anything you've read in the last week that you've wished, like, man, I wish I wrote that? Like, that was a good one on our beat.
Yeah. I mean, every day. I mean, one of the reasons I write a daily newsletter is because I'm just constantly blown away by the stuff that my colleagues are working on. Your colleague, Di, wrote a really interesting story about Google under Sundar Pichai that I'm going to be talking about with him about on Twitter Spaces a little bit later today. Slipping a plug for that. So that was a really good one. Candidly, like, I think June has been the slowest month for platform news, certainly since I started Platformer. I think we're in the midst of a kind of mega narrative reset where from like 2016 to early 2021, the story was, oh my God, Donald Trump is the president. Are we going to survive? And now we're in what sort of feels like the eye of the storm, in between like the last, major threat to our democracy and the next one. And I think right now there is kind of a collective holding of the breath. I think you have some really smart people who are ringing alarms. It's like I read every story that's like, 900 scholars of democracy, warn that the United States has 20 minutes left, which is like, we're seeing a lot of those stories lately. But like, if you're a journalist, like, what do you do about it, right? I mean, this is like kind of one of those giant systemic challenges that we typically have a lot of problems writing about, because like our work day to day is typically so oriented around like an event is happening or is about to happen. And this is like kind of a story about a steady erosion and, some unpredictable things that may be coming down the road. So one of the things I'm thinking about, both in terms of like, what I'm writing about, like the work that I'm reading that others are doing, and for my own writing, it's like, what is the most important story to be told right now at the intersection of tech and democracy? Because frankly, a lot of the stories that we wrote for the past 5 years feel really old to me, right? Like, I no longer think it's interesting when somebody finds a bad post on a platform, but the story will still get written. And sometimes it deserves to be written. But like, I do think it's time for a different set of questions, and I'm taking vacation next week. And like, that is part of the plan, is like, what is the next set of questions?
I mean, how do you write about the erosion of truth and the idea of truth, and being part of a society where people have lost that, right? They've lost that thing where they can make a decision between choosing to believe truth and choosing to believe fiction. That's incredibly hard, especially for journalists, when the basis of our job is like, people want to hear the truth.
100%. And in some ways, like, I have made this easier on myself because I've decided I basically only want to write for a group of like-minded people, right? Like, I am not trying to serve the mass mainstream. I'm not trying to go door to door and persuade QAnon, believers that their ideas are false. I'm basically trying to reach people who work in this industry or in an adjacent industry like disinformation research. And I'm trying to tell them, what's happening in the world that's important to them. I'm trying to analyze it. I'm trying to break some news now and then about it. And then ultimately, I want to nudge them to make the best possible decision where I can. Not to say I'll always know it, right? But, I try to highlight good ideas as I see them. And that's sort of what I feel like I can do, right? Like, I'm not a platform determinist, in the sense that, like, I don't think that if Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Snap all had the right policies and had perfect enforcement, we would live in a utopia. But I think that it's better than the alternative. And so, like, figuring out what are those policies, like, what are the ways that they can be nudged to do the right thing, that's important to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I find myself more and more, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, but like, I find myself more and more interested in what's happening in other countries and the rest of the world, because in some ways it's so much more egregious than what happens here in the United States. And in some ways you also feel like you can affect more change in other countries. You can expose local leaders, groups that are manipulating social media for their advantage. I find myself right now really, really interested in anti-vaccine narratives and how they're spreading abroad in countries with really low vaccination rates, and how this is unfortunately something the US seems to be exporting to other countries, this anti-vax mentality. Like, I don't want to say like I've given up on America. I haven't. I love writing about the United States and covering the United States. But in some ways, I feel this responsibility to write a lot more about the rest of the world now, which unfortunately we seem to, I felt like I kind of ignored during much of the Trump presidency, because what was happening here felt so insane and on the precipice of new insanity every day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I did too. I'm really grateful, by the way, that we have a new publication called Rest of World that covers these issues.
Yes.
I think they're doing really brilliant work. I would imagine that people who are watching this are already following them, but they're easily my favorite new publication of the past year or so. For me, the story I can't get enough of is India. The Modi government, I just feel like, offers us such a good preview of like what it would look like if we had an authoritarian conservative president in the United States. Like, what sort of moves would they be making with the platforms? And I think it would be all the same things. It would be like threatening to put platform executives in jail. It would be raiding their offices. And so, I think sometimes in the United States as reporters, like, we feel like, well, if we write about another country, people will just ignore it. I think that maybe my columns I've written about India haven't gotten the same reach as some of the other ones have, but at least for my audience, I think that there is an awareness that all of this stuff ties together, that arguments that are going to be used in one country will ultimately be used somewhere else. And, maybe that's part of what we do during our time in this eye of the storm is we just highlight what is going on elsewhere. And one of the ways that we sell it is by saying like, it is actually going to happen here too. And like, this is the preview. And if you knew this was going to happen, what would you do in advance? Because it's actually going to happen.
100%. Yeah. I love your work on India. And I'm doing a story, probably shouldn't talk about it because it's not out yet, but whatever. I mean, it's hopefully being edited today.
Tease it, just give it a tease.
It's looking at Iran and how Iran has focused on Israel as a target of disinformation. And there's been so much written. Even yesterday, there was a DOJ announcement about the US shutting down a number of Iranian news sites, which were used to spread disinformation. But what my story looks at is how in Israel, which is obviously a much, much smaller, more focused target for Iranian, Iran cyber actors, they've been able to do some really amazing, sophisticated things through Telegram, through WhatsApp, through direct messaging of people, both to persuade them of their disinformation narratives and to gather intelligence. And I mean, it's such a, at first my editors were like, I don't know, how many people did this affect? Like 1 million people? And I'm like, yes, but the point is they're doing it there now because it's great practice for doing it here in the United States. 100%. And whatever happens in a small, you almost think of it as like a perfect laboratory for a new type of attack, a new type of disinformation strategy that they can then scale out and do in America or do anywhere else.
Completely. And I mean, if you think about these as like cat and mouse games where, people are always changing their tactics, like the relevance is so clear. I also feel like one of the mega narratives of the past year has just been like cybersecurity disasters, right? Ransomware, hacking, all of this type of stuff. And like, to me, it's the same thing where it's like, these are, technologies, if we want to call them that like get invented or perfected in places like China or North Korea or Russia. And then they come over here and then we have a huge problem. Like I would be thinking about disinformation tactics in the same way. They're going to get, maybe they'll be perfected here first, but like there's a, greater chance they'll be perfected elsewhere. And then they will come home to roost.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the first stories I wrote for the New York, because I was actually hired to be a cybersecurity reporter. This is everything that's happened since then has been a happy accident. But one of the first stories I wrote for the New York Times right before I went on maternity leave was about how cybersecurity professionals were seeing all this new software, all these new tactics being tested in countries. And that if they wanted to figure out what hackers were planning next, they wouldn't watch America or Europe. They would watch countries in Southeast Asia. They would watch countries in Latin America and Africa and see what was being tested out there. And then they could learn and say, oh, okay, well, that's the new strategy. That's the new approach. And I still remember the quote. One of them was like, if you were a thief and you had a new way of stealing BMWs, would you go to Beverly Hills and try it out with the best police force, where there's like a police car in every corner? No, you're going to go to some other neighborhood where there's probably less of a police presence and try and steal one BMW here, one BMW there, see if it worked, and then roll it out in your really big market.
Right. That's so interesting.
Yeah. Casey, are we supposed to take questions now?
Are there questions?
Are there questions? You must have questions for us. Please send us questions. Oh, we're waiting on audience questions. Audience, please send questions. All right. Well, until the audience questions come, I guess we can chat a little bit more. I feel like you mentioned rest of the world, and I thought that one of the things they did that was really smart was in the title. I was going to say the title, the name that they gave themselves. This idea of the rest of the world was so perfect to me, because it is often how newsrooms treat everything that isn't the United States.
Yeah, and it is very tongue in cheek, because this is also how tech companies refer to non-American markets, right? It's in, you'll note it's not rest of the world, it's rest of world, right? I mean, there's like something sort of really brutal about it. And if I have a fear for them, it's that the branding like undersells what they're delivering. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, it's just like a heap of issues over there. When, as I think we're talking about, like the rest of the world is where you need to look if you want to understand like what is the next set of like information threats over here. You know, I mean, this story, I don't know how to feel about it, but so this week, in terms of, stories that were interesting, the United States they seized a bunch of domains from Iran, right? And saying like, these are disinformation. And I have no real doubt that they were. It was, basically like state-run media, but like, and we've already seen other countries, seize domains essentially on this pretext, right? Like Hong Kong got I think it was like a Canadian website shut down because it was, hosting some dissent. But you can just see like how many other countries are going to say, well, the United States is seizing domains because it's disinformation. Like you can call anything disinformation. There's no standard of proof. And if you're an authoritarian, it just feels like, so like, what a wonderful club you now have to like go and beat your dissenters with.
I know, and we've seen that here on the right? We've seen people on the right say calling things disinformation that one would argue with the opposite. We have our first question, which is actually really on topic. You mentioned the rest of the world in terms of resources towards disinformation. Could you discuss how these companies allocate labor internationally, expanding beyond digital, the physical labor of keeping the platforms going? I think that's a super important question because a lot of the problems that we've just talked about in terms of India, Philippines, are twofold, right? One is that the platforms expanded incredibly quickly into these countries. It was a rush to get in. Facebook was well aware that if they didn't get into, I'm using Myanmar as an example again, but it was a race, right, between an American company, Facebook, and a Chinese equivalent. And whoever got on the ground first was going to capture that audience. But they didn't scale up internally. They didn't understand the policy issues. I would argue, now they've hired some great people on the ground, but it took them far too long to understand it. And if you're going into a country like Myanmar, over 100 languages are spoken in Myanmar. At the time, they had one Burmese content moderator. I mean, Casey, content moderation is something you've written a ton about, and better than anyone, like the number of content moderators that exist in other languages is frightening. It's frighteningly small.
Yeah, I mean, this just will be the scandal that deservedly haunts Facebook forever. And also, by the way, I think this is just the problem of hosting so much crucial political speech inside what are basically digital shopping malls. Like the objective of the shopping mall is to open as many storefronts as possible, and everything else will always be secondary to that, right? So as long as there was a big, market opportunity in Myanmar, like that was going to be the primary objective. And I think looking back, what's clear is that before Facebook opened in a country, they frankly should have been required legally to have some sort of plan for like, how are you going to understand the communications on your platform, right? Like, can you read what is being said here? And if not, then actually you cannot open here, right? That seems like a really obvious place where we could have some, regulation that would not destroy innovation, but would provide meaningful protections for these people. So yeah, that's that one is just one that they're never going to be able to shake, I don't think.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I want to applaud Facebook for dedicating a lot more resources. They have now local country reps. They have scaled up their content moderators. But I think if Facebook was ever going to be transparent about this, which they're not, they would tell us how many, per population, per number of posts that gets put on Facebook in each language, how many content moderators do you have? And there should be a requirement that per, 1,000 posts that come online in that language, you have X amount of content moderators. If you can't, if it's too much or too hard or whatever, then some of the solution needs to be, because it cannot just be that you have this situation, which we saw also play out in India during the elections with a sheer amount of posts. It was almost impossible for Facebook to police in real time and to moderate, I should say, in real time.
Yeah,
we have one more question, which I think is kind of interesting. We have 2 minutes. I think we can get to it. Perennial question in journalism that is particularly prescient for tech journalists is that there's an inherent tension between cultivating long-term relationships with sources and feeling free to report on those sources critically. If your sources that are necessary for your beat don't like your coverage of them, they can go elsewhere, giving others embargoed press releases and useful information. How do you navigate this? I love this question because I get asked it a lot. And I would say this: embargoed information is very rarely useful. Yeah. We like getting things into embargo because we can prep, but the best stories we get are not press releases and they're not embargoed information. And the best sources are the ones that understand that I'm not I'm not black or white on Facebook. I'm a nuanced individual with nuanced thinking, and that they tell me something and it's not like I'm just going to accept their version of it. Often sources come to me with something and then I'll investigate it and find out they were wrong or they didn't have the full story. And I'll go back to them and I'll say, look, you thought this thing happened that was unfair, but actually you didn't have the full story. And I'm not going to report it because what you told me isn't the full picture of what happened.
Yeah, I think all of that is really well said. I think about this a lot too. It's like sort of like I think about it in terms of like, we all like to think of ourselves as like, nobody has captured us, but like if you were captured, who would it be by? To me, it's like I just think it's important to write for at least two big audiences at once, and like one that is like for people who work at these platforms and are like working on stuff, but then two, it's like for everybody who's affected by them, and like both of those sides are going to hold you accountable, and so the hope is that they don't sort of like make you like so like neutral that you're boring. But at the same time, I think that if you know that both of those like sort of interest groups are going to be pressuring on you, hopefully they can actually get you to a better place, right? Maybe like, the industry will pull you back from your wildest criticisms, but your sort of like broader audience is going to say like, hey, why are you carrying so much water for these platforms? And so I just try to make sure I always have like all of those voices in my head at the same time, and it just becomes like a filter that I use for evaluating information.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look for good sources, like people ask me, like, what makes a good source? And I'm like, a moral compass, somebody with a moral compass. And I think moral compasses always point north, and they'll come to me with good stories because they'll see something that's wrong and they'll want to call that out. And that's our jobs, is to call it out. Our job is to hold the powerful to account. Totally. And on that, on that note, Casey, thank you so much. It's always really fun to talk to you.
Oh man, this is a blast. Thank you, Sheera.
Yeah. And I think we are now passing it back to Rose.
Thank you, Sheera and Casey, for that fascinating conversation. Of course, if you want to follow more of their really insightful reporting, you can check out Casey's daily newsletter and Platformer, and Sheera's coverage with the New York Times, as well as her upcoming book called An Ugly Truth: Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination.